So the next topic is Brexit. For this topic, we have invited Boyd McCleary. Just a brief introduction. Boyd McCleary joined the British Diplomatic Service in 1972 after taking a degree in German language and literature from Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He worked initially for the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland, but then transferred to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, so he's an ex-diplomat. He's been posted to Bonn, Seoul, Ankara, Ottawa, Düsseldorf, Kuala Lumpur, and the British Virgin Islands. Boyd is now retired. He is an avid European and has been very much dismayed at Britain's decision to leave the European Union. He will give you the background to this decision, explain the reasons for, and look into the implications for the UK and Europe and possibly us.
It's very nice to be here. What Barbara didn't say was that my wife is also a member of AIIC and is interpreting later this morning, although she's not interpreting me, which is, though she spends quite a lot of her time doing that. Yeah? So I'm going to talk to you this morning about Brexit. I know it's a subject which you'll all be familiar, but I'll try and set it in historical context and talk about why it happened, talk a bit about the referendum itself, the political aftermath, the negotiations, what happens next, insofar as one can tell what will happen next, and say something about the implications for the UK, for the EU, and for interpreters. So the first thing to say is that the background is that Britain actually was physically part of Europe for a long, long time. And the first Brexit was when Britain separated from Europe back in about 6000 BC. I say that because the people who live in these islands, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, have always been part of Europe. The Celts were the same people who lived in Germany and France and Belgium and the Netherlands. We had Vikings come in from other parts of Europe. We had Anglo-Saxons, we had Normans. There have been royal marriages between the Netherlands, Germany. We had lots of kings who were from continental Europe. We had Victoria and her extended family right across Europe, many, many royal families. You remember some of the pictures of Victoria's funeral when there were crowned heads from every European country imaginable. So those connections are very much part of our heritage. We had alliances, we fought wars in Europe as well as in the UK, and it was always in Britain's interest to be part of Europe. We sat at the table at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 when the nation-state principles were established. We were part of that European entity, but somehow we always saw ourselves as something different, something perhaps better. We had the Mother of Parliaments. It's the oldest parliament in the UK, with the possible exception of Iceland. We were seen as an imperial power. One of the stories is that Britain, across the world, we had red bits on all our maps, and the sun never set in the British Empire. We were the masters, the originators of the Industrial Revolution. We were an island, of course. We had the Royal Navy, which dominated the world's oceans. So we were a superpower. We had a currency which was a major currency across the world, sitting alongside the dollar and now the euro. So we always felt that we were part of Europe and yet somehow different. If I now go to the end of the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War, again, we were sitting in the European continent. We'd been part of that European war, but we felt somewhat different from the French and the Germans and the Dutch and the Belgians, the others who were participants, because we were very much untouched by war in a way that France and Netherlands and Belgium weren't. We were, of course, not a defeated power. We were a victorious power. We sat at the top table alongside the US and the USSR. We were part of the Bretton Woods system. We were a founding member of the UN, and in fact, the first major UN meeting was held here in London. We were members of the Security Council. We were founder members of NATO. We had the atomic bomb. We were different from France and Germany. But Churchill understood who was our Prime Minister at the time, understood that there was something happening in Europe which was dangerous and to which there needed to be a reaction. And he made a major speech in Zurich in 1946 when he talked about the need for a United States of Europe. That was the first time that expression actually appeared. It was the same speech in which he talked about an iron curtain falling over Europe, falling across the continent, because he saw the risks that our wartime ally, the United States, the USSR, would become our enemy. He foresaw the Cold War, and he foresaw the need for European countries to come together to counter that. But he also believed at that stage that Britain was not, it was not appropriate for the UK to join that United States of Europe. He encouraged the others. Britain was party to some of the initial discussions. We did attend some of the early meetings. We did join. We became an associate member of the European Coal and Steel Community, the Montan Union, which was the precursor to the EU, but we did not become a member of the European Union. Indeed, we decided not to do so, and we joined up an alternative body, which was known as the European Free Trade Area, EFTA, of which we were a founding and initial member. Why didn't we join? Because we were interested in establishing a free trade area, but not a political union. And that's a theme which is important to understand in the context of today's debate about Europe and the future of Europe. We were concerned also that by joining something with our European partners, we'd somehow abandon our old friends in the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, and so on. We had these long-standing ties with Commonwealth nations around the world, and there was a clear sense that if we joined up with our European friends, we would somehow be leaving those Commonwealth countries with whom we had a system of Commonwealth preference or imperial preference in the lurch. And Britain also wanted to maintain some autonomy in tariffs, particularly vis-à-vis the US. These are important themes. This is 60, 70 years ago, and these are the same themes which are recurred today in the debate about Brexit. And also Britain was frankly sceptical as to whether the European revival, the European project, would be successful. So we decided not to join. But only a few years later, the European Union was formed, or the AIIC was formed in 1957. Only a few years later, we changed our mind. During the 1960s, we actually recognized that Europe was doing quite well. We'd had a bit of a bruising experience with Suez, where we and the French tried to take on international action, and the Americans didn't like it and essentially told us to leave, to stop doing what we were doing. We were bruised. We were somewhat concerned that we weren't quite as powerful as we were by ourselves. So we started thinking whether we shouldn't actually join Europe. By this stage, Ted Heath had become leader of the Conservative Party, and he was very much pro-European. He had visited Germany during the pre-war period. He'd attended one of the major Nazi rallies, I think at Nuremberg, and he saw the dangers which Europe was potentially liable to. He could see that there were risks from right and left, and he thought the best way for Britain to succeed, to go forward, was to join Europe, so he decided to apply. And we applied, but the French said no. General de Gaulle said no, and he said no not once but twice. There were two separate applications which were both turned down by de Gaulle, and de Gaulle was a bit concerned. Why was he worried about the UK joining? We only actually got in after he left office, and Pompidou established a good relationship with Heath, and he allowed Britain to go. He removed the French veto. The reason why de Gaulle was unsure was because he realized that Britain was really interested only in free trade, in the movement of goods and services. And he was concerned that Britain would somehow undermine the aspirations that he had for a greater Europe with France at its heart. So perhaps he was right. Perhaps he was concerned correctly that Britain would be an uncomfortable member of the European Union, would look to the US, and would not be so interested, as he certainly was, in promoting greater European unity. Now, we applied to join, but there was opposition then. And I show you these slides because they actually are familiar to the slides which you could see today in almost all the papers about Britain and Europe today. The Brexit debate is about the death to British democracy. Sovereignty was a big issue then, it's a big issue today. Keep Britain out. Don't discriminate against the rest of the world. Again, our old friends in the Commonwealth. the common market would mean widespread poverty. There was a concern that we were a prosperous country at that stage and we might become less prosperous. Enoch Powell, who's there on the left, was a big fan of no. He did not want us to join the European Union. You have no, again, Commonwealth preference. And that's interesting. The last one says, friendship, yes, membership, no. We want a referendum. This is 1957, 1958. We want a referendum. And no referendum was actually held. And we joined the European Union. Yes to Europe. The press was delighted. Parliament voted in favour. Actually, interestingly, again, this is reminiscent of what's happening today. In order to secure the majority, which was 112 in Parliament, we're in a day in history. In order to secure that majority, Heath had to reach across the political divide. He only won that vote because of support from Labour politicians. The Conservative Party itself was not sufficient to secure a majority in favour of EU membership. He reached across the political divide, which many have argued Theresa May should do today, and he secured a 112 majority, and that was sufficient to get us in, and the press were happy. It was a victorious day for Britain. The media were content, were satisfied that this was a right thing for us to do. But shortly after we joined, which was 1973, this is Ted Heath actually signing the papers, Alec Douglas Hume on his right and Geoffrey Rippon on his left. Historic day indeed, but very shortly afterwards, the reality of membership kicked in and we were in trouble. Heath lost the elections in 1974. Labour won the election. Labour had been anti-European. Labour had felt that Britain was not well situated in Europe. They were concerned that somehow our rights and responsibilities would be diminished. They saw Europe as a capitalist plot against the working class man. But Wilson, the Prime Minister who succeeded Heath, was something of a pragmatist, and he decided that he would hold a referendum. He did hold a referendum in 1973. Most people have forgotten that. There was a successful referendum campaign, and there was a 2/3 to 1/3 majority in favour of staying in Europe. But once in, we actually realized that it was a pretty difficult place to survive in. We had a lot of economic problems. By the end of the 1970s, we were in deep economic trouble. We had 6 million unemployed across Europe. The UK was in difficulty. We had the IMF in the door. The first time and only time the IMF actually was sitting in British government, demanding that we do X, Y, and Z. And we had a pretty torrid time with our European partners trying to reform the common agricultural policy. At that stage, I was actually agriculture attaché in the British Embassy in Bonn, and I spent all my time trying to change the agricultural policy of Europe. Because we had only 3% of our farmers, of our population in agriculture. The rest of Europe had 15, 20%. The Germans, the French were really making a lot of money out of the common agricultural policy. That was the prime policy of Europe at that stage. Over 70% of Europe's budget went on agriculture, and almost none of that came to the UK. So we were feeling uncomfortable, unloved, and not benefiting from European membership. Also during the 1970s, the Common Fisheries Policy was established. Common Fisheries Policy means shared waters for all European countries. Who had most of the water? The UK. What did that mean? The UK fishermen lost all their fish to the French, to the Spanish, to the Portuguese. It set a bad precedent. So people were starting to wonder at this stage whether Europe really was such a good thing for Britain, or whether we let ourselves in for something we didn't really want. By the 1980s, you had this lady in power. I don't even remember her. She's got a handbag in her arm. She used to go in and handbag her European partners and say, "We want our money back." Now, why did she say that? Because of this issue with agriculture. Because the bulk of the European funds were going in agriculture. We didn't get that, and we were paying much more into Europe than we were getting back out. So again, there was a sense of injustice. And Margaret Thatcher, who had actually campaigned for membership of the European or the EEC in the 1950s and 60s, she actually now realized that Europe was a potentially hostile place. She spent 5 years getting what became known as the British Rebate, and that was a very difficult time. She was constantly banging on the table in Brussels and saying, "We want our money back." And although she also tried to get what she could out of the European Union, not just for Britain, but for the wider market, she was instrumental in establishing what is now called the single market. There was a British commissioner, Lord Cockfield, in Brussels at that stage, who was the main proponent of the single market. But you remember that's also to do with Britain's prime interest, which was free trade, better movement of goods and services. So that's one of the reasons why she went for that. But we were also instrumental in arguing for greater political cooperation. Margaret Thatcher actually lost the premiership over Europe because many felt that she was too Eurosceptic. Her own Chancellor and other senior ministers resigned. After Margaret Thatcher came John Major. Again, things happened in that time. Schengen was created, but Britain stayed out of Schengen. Britain felt that it was not ready to share its borders and customs procedures with other European countries. So this is part of the process. You remember, you're building up a picture here of Britain being in, but also half out, being semi-detached, being what I call a country member of the European Union, not fully paid up, somehow only an associate, not fully believing in the European project in the same way as the French and the Germans did. So Major spent a lot of his time as Premier fighting for the Maastricht Treaty, which he didn't really want, which was never a great treaty in the first place, but he was having to fight day after day after day in Parliament to win votes on Maastricht. And during that period, there emerged a group of MPs within the Conservative Party who were opposed to the Maastricht Treaty, who became known as the Euroskeptics. He called them the bastards. And that's a term which is also quite familiar to those who are following the debate in Britain today within the Conservative Party. That group of bastards, the Eurosceptics, is critical in understanding what's happened and why we are where we are today in relation to Brexit. He won an election, but actually he's widely regarded as being an unsuccessful Prime Minister because he was tied up in this long-standing debate about Maastricht, which he found it difficult to win. He was succeeded. Again, he fell over Europe, and his successor was Tony Blair. Tony Blair was a big pro-European. He came across as a reformer, a radical reformer, someone who wanted to lead and who wanted very much to Europe to be at the heart of Europe, Britain to be at the heart of Europe, a phrase actually which was coined by Major, but Major never made that happen. And Blair too got sidelined. He would like to have been a leader in Europe, a major voice for change and for progress. He actually is widely believed to have been in favour of the euro, but when the euro was established, a critical factor in the broadening and deepening of the EU, Britain decided that we would not join. Blair was distracted. He was distracted particularly by the Iraq War, for which he will go down in history as the person who took Britain into Europe. And who opposed that? The Germans and the French opposed entry into the Iraq War. Britain was again seen as separate and different from its European partners. So I'm trying to build up a picture here which explains why Britain, although we were members of this union and where I believe we had huge benefits, we were somehow not fully paid up. We were not fully subscribed members, and things were happening which are already foretold what has actually occurred in the last couple of years. The next Prime Minister was David Cameron, who had a pretty difficult time. He tried to stop people talking about Europe. He realized that this was tying the whole British debate. He said, stop banging on about Europe, but his whole Prime Ministership was defined by Europe because he was enticed into calling a referendum. He called that referendum because he was under huge pressure from the Eurosceptics. He was losing votes to UKIP. There were UKIP, which was an pro-independence party, was established at that time, and there was a massive amount of support moving away from the Conservative Party towards Europe, towards UKIP. His own MPs, 2 or 3 backbench MPs, actually defected, joined UKIP. He was really worried that the Conservative Party was going to fragment and fall apart, and so he was effectively forced to pledge in an election campaign that he would hold a referendum on Europe, which he did. And we all know that that was held on the 23rd of June, 2016. And the question was binary. Should the UK remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? It was a binary question put to the people. And Britain's not very good at referenda. We don't do it very often. We're not used to it. And it was an awful campaign. It was a nasty, ill-tempered campaign, ill-informed, with both sides shouting at each other and no one really understanding properly what the issues were, with both sides exaggerating the risks of becoming leaving the European Union or the risks of remaining in the European Union, the negatives of staying in the European Union. We had lies being told, fake news left, right and centre. The top picture is one of a bus, a campaign bus for the Leave side, which was driving around the country saying that Britain pays £350 million a week to the EU. If we weren't members of the EU, we could put all that money into our National Health Service. That's a nonsense. It was a complete made-up figure. It was an absolute figure for our gross contribution rather than our net receipts, net contribution. It was made up, but people believed it. People also believed that Turkey was about to join the EU, and immigration was a big issue at the time. This was at the time of the 1 million immigrants coming into Germany and Sweden and so on. And the real fear was stoked up that Turkey was just about to join, and there were 80 million, 90 million Turks about to flood the UK. There was a programme on television a couple of nights ago, and the Leave campaign, it's about the Leave campaign, about the guy who ran the Leave campaign. He said the two things that they hammered on about, they banged the table about 350 million and Turkey. 350 million and Turkey. That's what won the campaign for the Leave side. But it wasn't only those issues which were specific to the EU. It was also because people in Britain were fed up with austerity. They were fed up with their politicians. They were fed up with their bankers. They were fed up with their leaders. There was a loss of trust in the political class. And so some of the vote was about not just Europe, but about the general malaise in the country. When it came to the day, the UKIP side and the Leave side called it Independence Day. Say goodbye to Brussels, waste and corruption, Independence Day, 23rd of June. Nigel Farage actually on the evening thought that they weren't going to win. Most of the polls said beforehand, they were neck and neck, but most of the polls thought that the Remain side would win. And Nigel Farage was quoted on television. He appeared before a polling station, said it looks as though Remain will edge it. But within a couple of hours, the first results started coming out, and it was clear, we're out. That was announced on television by David Dimbleby. We're out, and Cameron wasted no time in leaving himself. He stood on the steps of Downing Street the next day and said he's standing down as Prime Minister. And that was, he has not been seen in the UK political scene since, and will, I think, rue the day that he called the election, the referendum. The result was 48 in favour of remaining, 52 in favour of leaving. But what's interesting is the way in which the vote split. You see from the map, Scotland, Northern Ireland, large parts of the southeast, London, all voted firmly in favour of Remain. Most of Wales and the rural parts of England voted for Leave. You look at the voter breakdown, you'll also see that older people tended to vote Leave, younger people tended to vote Remain. The vote was only given to 18-year-olds, not to younger people, and most younger people were very much in favour of remaining and are very angry about what has happened. So there are generational issues which have now arisen. There are north-south issues which have arisen. There are urban-rural issues which have arisen. There are north-south issues. There are Scotland-England issues. There are Northern Ireland issues. We're a very divided country, and that's persisted beyond the immediate referendum campaign. Today, if you look at what's happening in the country, if you talk to people, it's a very hot topic. Our introductory speaker mentioned that it's hot. Every time you sit around a dinner table, every time you meet someone, you're almost scared to talk about Brexit because people's emotions run very high. People's feelings run very high. And decisions were made, perhaps on a false premise, but the bulk of people who decided then they wanted to vote Remain probably still want to stay in the EU. The bulk of people who said they wanted to leave probably still want to leave and are very angry that we haven't left by now, 2.5 years later. So we're an angry country. Why did people vote to leave? They voted to take back control of money. Remember, we never joined the European Union, but we were sending all this money, the Leave campaign said, to Europe, and we could have used that for our own domestic good, perhaps in particular for the National Health Service, which is in trouble. Borders. We didn't like the prospect of many more people coming into the UK. We had the UK population grown by 5 million over the last 10, 15 years, and there were large numbers of people coming in from the EU and from outside the EU. And people's minds, they don't differentiate between EU people and non-EU people, and they felt that we were being flooded by immigrants. They saw what had happened in Germany. They saw the anger in Germany. There's definitely a right-wing backlash, and space has been created by the referendum for right-wing agitation. You see it on the streets of outside Parliament the last few days. You've seen right-wing extremists attacking Remain MPs. It's a very nasty, nasty feeling at the moment. And it wasn't just about the EU. As I said, it was also about austerity, anger about the fact that we'd had years and years of austerity and people felt left behind. In a way, it's directly comparable to what happened in the US, why Trump was voted in. You've got the Rust Belt people who felt left behind, felt that the political class had let them down, and they felt that they had to do something to object, to register their concern, their anger, and they voted to leave the European Union. There was also a loss of confidence in traditional politicians. It was a populist debate. People like Nigel Farage, the head of UKIP, and Boris Johnson and Michael Gove are populists. They're quite blatant about their populism. They don't attempt to discuss the things on a high moral or economic plateau. Michael Gove actually said, experts? Who needs experts? And the reason why he said that was because all the experts were telling us it was nonsense to leave the European Union. It's crazy. But he said, who needs experts? And that's what the man in the street heard. He doesn't like experts because experts have been telling him for years that they were okay, but actually they weren't okay. They were feeling left behind. They were feeling as though the political class had abandoned them. And frankly, there was no recognition in the campaign of the role that Europe had played in maintaining peace and stability across the continent for 2 generations. I think that's one of the major failures of the political class in the UK, never properly to explain to the people of this country that Europe was actually the reason why we had peace and stability across the continent. It did come up occasionally in the debate, but the answer was from the Leave side, oh, it's not Europe did that, that's NATO. Nothing to do with the EU, that was NATO. But that's a nonsense. As you all know, those people who come from the European continent, the stability which has been created by the EU, the way in which the EU has grown democracy across the continent has been critical in the way in which Europe has remained a stable part of the world. So Cameron resigned, Theresa May became Prime Minister, there was a general election, and that resulted in a hung Parliament. And that's critical to understand what's happening now in the Brexit debate. If you see the slide here, it shows that Parliament was almost split 50-50. Theresa May just got a few votes short of 50%. And in order to govern, she had to bring in a sort of quasi-coalition. It's not called a coalition formally, but she had to bring on board 10 members of a small party in Northern Ireland called the Democratic Unionist Party in order to get any legislation through Parliament, to get her budget through Parliament. She relies on that to win votes in the House of Commons. But Labour is a solid bloc, almost as large as the Conservatives, and they have support from other progressive parties such as the Scottish Nationalists and Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalists. And that means that anything that May tries to do on Brexit or anything else is extremely difficult and relies heavily on support from this small Northern Ireland party who hold the card, and we'll come back to that in a second. So she set off on her negotiations, and of course the Brexit side said it would be easy, nothing simpler than to negotiate your way out of the European Union, just leave. But it wasn't that easy. I'll leave you to look at that slide for a second. This is May trying to negotiate Brexit, and she hasn't made a great job of it. It wasn't easy, and the parliamentary arithmetic made it even more difficult. And she has gone through all the various issues which were under negotiation. There was the divorce bill. How much do we pay? The Leave side said, we don't have to pay anything. We just leave the club. We don't need to pay anything. But that was a nonsense, of course, because there are lots of commitments we had made as members which we had to recognise, and in the end an agreement was reached on the divorce bill. One of the other early issues was citizens' rights. What happens to Britons who are living in other European countries? What happens to Europeans who are living here in Britain? That was a big issue, and it was of very, very serious concern to the EU side, and of course the UK, frankly, doesn't want to lose its European citizens who've been here for many years. We are heavily reliant on those citizens in areas like the National Health Service. And the biggest issue which has emerged, and was one of the major reasons why we haven't done a deal, which is likely to command a majority in the House, is the Irish border. This sort of came out of left field for May. I don't think she fully understood what was happening. I think she was outflanked by the Irish government, but she had to agree something which is called a backstop. I don't know whether you've been following this debate. I'm not sure what the word backstop is in French or German or Polish or Swedish, but the word is backstop, and it's a means by which to ensure that there is no hard border on the island of Ireland. Remember, our country is called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I come from Northern Ireland, so it means a lot to me. And why it's important is that the Northern Ireland, which is the northern part of the island of Ireland, is part of the UK. Southern Ireland is a separate country. And we have, as you know, for many years we had what was called the Troubles, the really serious political unrest in Northern Ireland because of Irish republicanism, because there were bombings and shootings and people trying to persuade Northern Ireland to leave, or the British government that Northern Ireland should leave the Union. That didn't happen. There was an agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, and now Ireland is pretty peaceful. Northern Ireland has been very peaceful and actually also economically successful for the last 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And no one wanted to upset that peace and stability within Ireland. No one wanted there to be a hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Before the Good Friday Agreement, there were customs posts on that border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And if we reinstall those customs posts because there are tariff differences, that means there's a target for the terrorists. People will start bombing and shooting again, and no one wants that to happen. So this backstop agreement was envisaged by the European Union to avoid a hard border. But it's become very difficult to reconcile leaving with a trade agreement which allows us to negotiate arrangements with other parts of the world, and yet having no hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So that was the most complex of issues in the negotiations. Of course, there are lots of other important stuff like trade and security relations and many more issues like airfares and so on. But these issues have not really yet been resolved. The first part of the negotiations were only about the three issues: the divorce bill, citizens' rights, and the Irish border and immigration. The rest has been left to the next phase after we've left the European Union, if we ever leave. So in November of 2018, May got her deal, but the reaction was very critical. She's looking for a Goldilocks solution, not too cold, not too hot, just right, but she didn't quite manage to achieve that. The Remainers thought that the solution was too hard. It was a hard Brexit. The Leavers thought it was too soft. And there's no parliamentary majority for what she has now been able to negotiate. I just quote Boris Johnson: "This is just about as bad as it could possibly be. We remain in a regulatory alignment with the EU, accepting EU rules, but unable to shape them." So one of the main refrains of the Leave campaign was we wanted to be makers, not takers of law. And as members of the European Union, we have to take EU law and incorporate it within the UK law. And that was the big issue of sovereignty. Leavers wanted to make our own laws, determine our own rights, have our own capacity to negotiate trade deals with the rest of the world. And they believe that the deal which Theresa May has negotiated will not succeed in giving us that. So May had to, she's presenting to Parliament the results of her negotiations and saying we have to have a deal or there's no deal, a deal or no deal, deal or no deal. But she had to duck a vote in Parliament before Christmas because she realised that she wasn't going to get a majority, and that's still the case today. That debate in Parliament resumed this week, and there's a vote next Tuesday, the 15th of January, and on the 15th of January we'll see what happens. But the predictions from all the pundits are that Theresa May will lose that vote. And she could lose it by 100, 150, some say even 200 votes. A massive defeat for the government on its major policy. And they've also lost votes already on minor issues related to Brexit. And so the prospects of May winning that vote are not good. And the Conservative Party is really struggling. Our political system is struggling. We're in a constitutional crisis. May was asked on television interview a couple of days ago what would happen. And she said, we're in uncharted waters. We don't know what's going to happen. We're in uncharted waters. We don't know what's going to happen. The interviewer said, I thought you might have been able to tell us, Prime Minister. But she hasn't told us. And I don't think she can tell us because she doesn't know. And her own parliamentary colleagues, her cabinet colleagues, are actually just fighting. Some of them want to stay, some of them want to go, some of them want a second vote, some of them want a Norway deal, some of them want a Canada Plus agreement. All these options are there, but there's a majority of Parliament does not want to leave on no deal. That's clear. There were a couple of votes in the Commons in the last few days which show that the majority of members do not want to leave on a no deal basis, but it's not clear what there is a majority for. There's a majority against no deal, but is there a majority for a second referendum? Unlikely. Is there a majority for Norway? Maybe. Is there a majority for staying in customs union? Possibly. Is there a majority for staying completely and just abandoning the whole process? Unlikely. And there's a concern that if we go for any of those other options, the Parliament and the leadership of this country will have been seen to break trust with the people because the people voted for Britain to leave the European Union. And that's really where we are today. We're in a situation where we don't frankly know what's going to happen next week. There will be a vote. One possible outcome is a general election. And the Labour Party, which has frankly sat on its hands through this whole process and has been extremely silent as to the substance of the matter, all the Labour Party wants to do is to have a general election so that they can come to power. You know, the Conservative Party held this referendum in the first place. Cameron held this election for party political reasons. He held the referendum to avoid problems within the Conservative Party, to try and stop banging on about Europe. That was party political. Labour Party are now saying, we want a general election. They don't give a stuff about the future of Europe, the future of our country. All they want to do is to gain power. I think this is a very dangerous situation. We're in a constitutional crisis, and I don't know exactly how we're going to get out of it. What are the implications for the UK? Negative. Even the government's own analysis, which has been published, shows that there's going to be a massive drop in GDP. Even if we leave on the softest terms, will there be a drop of 1.5–2% of GDP? On the worst terms, it could be a drop of 7–8% of GDP. The Confederation of British Industry said yesterday. I'm convinced that major foreign investors will leave because they cannot operate on World Trade Organization rules. Britain is more divided and will stay divided. And if there's a second referendum, that division will go on, will be perpetuated, will get worse. We will try to become a global power. We will try to negotiate trade agreements with other countries, although that will be difficult depending on the outcome of the negotiation itself. There's some prospect of us becoming what's been called Singapore and Thames, which means we will be a low regulatory environment like Singapore. We'll have free trade with everyone. We will have very low corporation tax and so on. We'll bring in lots of foreign direct investment. We'll certainly have less EU immigration, but I think we'll also have less political clout, less influence in the world. I think that we may feel we have to strengthen our links with the US, but I'm not sure that I'm very happy about that at the moment. We might have a Labour government. We might have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. I think actually one of the worst prospects we could possibly have. But one of my former colleagues in the Foreign Office said that he was Permanent Secretary, Deputy Minister in the Ministry of International Trade, was asked about what the implications were, and he said it's like giving up a 3-course meal for a packet of crisps. So take your pick. Do you want a 3-course meal or do you want a packet of crisps? I prefer the 3-course meal myself, and I'd rather stay in Europe. But I think Britain will lose, but Europe will also lose. There will be economic damage to the EU, other EU member states, particularly those who have strong links with the UK, Germany, Netherlands, the Northern European countries. I think that there is the prospect of further breakup of Europe. Italy is in serious difficulties. Of course, Greece has been there for some time. There could be a collapse of the whole European project with what's going on in France with the Gilets jaunes at the moment, with what's happening in other European countries. Germany has moved to the right. I think that there's a serious risk to the European project, and Brexit will not have helped that. Although, interestingly, the prospect of Brexit did bring the Europeans together. EU27 did negotiate as a single bloc very successfully, and I think the UK always underestimated that. But I think the UK's voice was always a pragmatic, sensible voice. I think the Germans and others appreciated that, and I think they will miss us. There will be a draft when the UK leaves the European Union. And I think that The relationship with the US may be weakened, which is probably to our long-term disadvantage. Of course, the Europeans say they want a strong relationship with the UK. The UK says it wants a strong relationship with Europe, but it will be more difficult in post-Brexit times. I tried to think about what the implications for interpreters would be. I don't really know, frankly, and I don't think anybody else does either. It will obviously be softer, easier, if a deal is reached, because residence will be easier, mutual recognition of qualifications, certainly for the transition period, which the next 2 years will be easier. But if we have no deal, lots of it will be up to individual European countries to decide what will happen, whether they will continue to offer the same rights as before, whether they will continue to recognise qualifications, whether they will continue to allow people like interpreters to operate on the same way as they do within the UK or Europe at present. And lots of it will be up to individual countries. People will have to work out whether they need work permits, whether they need visas to go across European borders between the UK and Europe. There may be chaos in flights and so on. People will need to think whether they have to carry, whether their driving license will work, whether their car insurance will work when they cross European borders now. It will be very complicated. It won't be frictionless. It will not be frictionless. So I think you all need to think what the implications are for yourselves. I won't try and tell you in detail, but certainly it won't be straightforward. I've said most of these things. I think that we were never really sure why we wanted to join, and when we got in, we were never fully committed. Our leadership failed us, I think, in trying to explain the benefits of membership. The Conservative Party was split on the issue from the start and has acted in party political reasons. The Labour Party has also failed miserably. I think that Corbyn is not a pro-European. The Brexit debate was appalling. Remainers failed to make the case, and Brexiters stuck the popular chord. It was a very populist campaign. Negotiations have been poorly handled, and May failed, I think, to understand the issue of Ireland. So that's what I think. I don't know what it'll be like, whether we'll be stuck out there by ourselves in a little rowing boat which has fallen off the back, or whether it'll be great, we'll be free at last. I don't like the prospect of being free from a continent with which I feel a great affinity. I feel very sad. On the morning after Brexit vote, I wrote to my 3 daughters and apologised on behalf of my generation. That's the way I still feel today. Thank you.